Hello everyone, I'm Deborah Robinson. I'm Head of Exhibitions at the new Art Gallery Walsall and curator of Anj Smith's major solo exhibition, A Willow Grows Aslant the Brook, which can be seen on display at the gallery until 5th of September this year. The exhibition comprises new and recent works, paintings and prints, many of which can be seen for the first time in Walsall. It offers a fantastic opportunity to be able to see a significant body of the artist's work together. I can advise that this event will be recorded and there will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. Following this short film of a tour of the exhibition, Anj will be in conversation with her friend, curator, writer and director of Chisenhall Gallery, Dr. Zoe Whitley. We're very thankful to Zoe, who, despite a very massive workload, has been able to contribute really valuably to our project by participating in this event and also writing her wonderful catalogue essay. It's been a delight to work with Anj on this exhibition. When we set out on this journey, we couldn't have imagined what was going to come before us, but Anj has showed great resilience, energy and creativity throughout and has created a really remarkable body of work that we hope to be able to share with you in Walsall.
Hi there, Anj.
Hi, you can definitely hear me now.
I can definitely hear you. So we're so excited to have everyone joining today, wherever they're joining from, near or far. So good evening or good afternoon or good morning. I'm thrilled to be here with my friend Anj. I'm really so in awe of your work. And so what I'm hoping we can do is just have a conversation about a range of your influences and the kind of concepts that breathe life into these paintings. And what I think is helpful about having had that film to orientate us is it reflects something that you said, just a few moments ago when we were talking before the event started, is that, seeing the paintings on the screen really won't give you very much. So a lot of times in the course of our discussion, if we alight on the details, it will give people a chance to kind of really focus on some of the essence of the work. And certainly for those of you who are able to get to Walsall between now and September, it's a must. So I'm kind of putting on my teenage theater kid emo hat, but I feel like I should start by reading an extended passage of Gertrude in Act 4, Scene 7, which reads as follows. There is a willow grows aslant a brook that shows his hoar leaves in the glassy stream. There with fantastic garlands did she come, of crowflowers, nettles, daisies, and long purples, that liberal shepherds give a gossamer name, but our cold maids do, dead men's fingers call them. There, on the pendant boughs of her coronet weeds, clambering to hang an envious silver broke, when down her weedy trophies and herself fell in the weeping brook, her clothes spread wide, and mermaid-like a while they bore her up, which time she chanted snatches of old lauds as one incapable of her own distress, or like a creature native and indued into that element, but long it could not be till that her garments, heavy with her drink, pulled the poor wretch from her melodious lay to muddy death. And I read that because I thought that the best place for us to begin this time for Q&A is with an explanation of you of where this title comes from.
Yeah, thank you for reading that so beautifully. It's such powerful language, isn't it? I think for me, the title refers to the location of Ophelia's demise. And Ophelia, the character of Ophelia in Hamlet, became an extraordinarily resonant catalyst for a series of paintings, which became the exhibition that is now in Walsall. And I think there are many reasons why she resonates for me as a character, but I think perhaps the most significant one for the purposes of our discussion today is she was continually gaslit and silenced and ridiculed and derided and constantly interrupted during her conversations with her boyfriend and her brother, her father, and the king. And what was so extraordinary about Ophelia is that she's subsequently been a sort of touchstone for female hysteria and madness and irrationality. But actually, I think what she did was she took the language of the day and cut it and spliced it to make a new way of expressing herself happen. Or she expressed herself in the language of flowers. And it's my contention that she wasn't mad, actually. She was just cut out from the power play and cut out from the ability to communicate in the way that the language allowed. And that spoke so much to my practice, the way I look at art history and the way I think about the history of painting. And yes, it went from there.
Brilliant. Why don't we'll look at some of the images as we go through. And for all of the participants in the room, I should also add that there is a Q&A function. And so please feel free to insert your own questions and I'll read those out to Anj, and we'll take the kind of last 15 minutes of the talk to make sure that that happens too, because we'd like for this to be as open and involving to as many people as possible. So here we have what's really the first work that you encounter in the exhibition. And we might move through some of it just to see where we can alight on details such as this, where we have this watery surface. And you said something interesting when you were talking about Ophelia and the language of flowers, because it made me think of the details that might otherwise go unmissed and how you give so much attention to those. And I think we see that here in this image. So what we have here is a surface that is icy, but you see that there are cracks in it. Is that correct? Can you talk us through some of what's happening in this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's so interesting about the flowers, and that's a really beautiful point, actually. Sometimes Ophelia is characterized, she's running across the stage and she's throwing columbines at Gertrude or fennel at the courtiers, but really she is making a lot of sense because those things would have been understood in Shakespeare's day. Columbines signifying infidelity, or the fennel, for the flattering courtiers. It all made perfect sense. But unless you're willing to spend the time deciphering how she's expressing herself from the margins, you're not going to understand. And I think that's really exactly the way that you have described the approach to the overlooked. That's a very interesting insight, actually. Thank you for that. Here, directly in this painting, what we're looking at is, it's quite hard to see from this detail, but when you pan out, you can't appreciate the full thing anyway. So I can work with this. It's a sort of post-catastrophic landscape, which is frozen over. And when you're looking at the painting in real life, you can see various stages of the ocean being frozen or unfrozen or thawing or cracking. And then underneath the surface, if you look very carefully, painted in quite a muted register, so you really have to spend time with the work, you'll see creatures just swimming underneath the surface, or you'll see perhaps a spent cartridge of a distress flare, such as this one, littering the surface as well. There's all sorts of creatures and debris and sort of maritime markers that are no longer used, that are just used as decoration now in this image. It's sort of an image of dissolution and an image of what would be desolation, except that signs of life are starting to emerge again. And this central arc, initially, I think it has the potential to be interpreted as a sort of rainbow-esque mark, but actually it is, if you look closer, you can see that it is a distress flare and that there are spent canisters on the bottom of the work as well.
I think that you've brought in something that we can also continue to talk about, because in the work, there's so much of this contrast and the existence of double meanings. And so I love that you mention weeds playing, such an important part in Shakespeare's cultural landscape, but specifically in Ophelia's world, which you're allowing us into through this series of paintings, how something like rue could symbolize repentance, but at the same time, for the audience attending the plays, they would have also understood it as a way to induce abortion. So that there are these ways of understanding things on multiple levels, and ways that might be, even to us today, quite shocking beneath what seems to be on the surface very beautiful or decorative. And I think that that's a helpful place for us to think about your approach in a number of different ways. You'd spoken to me before about the stream and the brook, or the willow and the brook, providing these sources of contrast in relation to the shallowness of one and the life and kind of monumentality of the other. And I see that in so many of the works that you have these particularly large elements that might seem to draw our attention, but then they're so carefully balanced with these kind of fine and minute details. Is that something? So can you talk us through a little bit of your compositional process? Because every painting is so complex.
Yeah, so the willow and the stream are fantastic components of contrast in this image. I think what I took from Hamlet in general, I reread it over lockdown, was just either, I'm relating it, of course, back to painting and painting now. So either we reject this sort of narrow, linear idea of history and of whose agency has been represented in history, which was the sort of narrow, shallow brook that's only traveling in one direction, or we embrace counter-narrative and the vital importance that we understand that is the way that history is recorded, in which case we have to look at everything very differently. And that, to me, was encapsulated in the location of Ophelia's demise, because she was in the Danish court, she was on the margins and she was silenced. So I think the play offers us today it asks us a question, or, which direction are we traveling in? Is very, very interesting and profound play, I think. When it comes to arranging the sort of visual hierarchy in a painting, each painting is so different. This painting, Deep Void, you see, it was very emotional actually seeing this work hung in Walsall, because I painted this work. I worked on this painting in the depths of the beginning of the pandemic. And it was a personal insight into this work was that I was actually sort of homeschooling and doing all of that in the day. And then at 6 p.m, I would go upstairs to my very small Victorian attic and paint through the night. And I was so exhausted that I was having sort of hallucinations, actually, in audio as well as visual hallucinations, out of sheer exhaustion. And I think the painting and the paint handling has got some of that sort of frenetic psychological intensity, because although it's very hard to see on screen, but there's actually lots of different painting languages that are employed with these different works. And the rocky surface on this painting, it's very intense and frenetic, and it's very present. It's very present. And for me, I feel that these paintings that I made during this pandemic, they do have a sense of witnessing a very strange psychological moment that when this is past, hopefully we will look back upon. But I feel almost as though these paintings, as crazy as this sounds, it feels as though they're bearing witness to that year in a way.
No, that doesn't sound crazy at all. I think that again is there in the work, this kind of impasto where the paint is built up so carefully, minute layer by minute layer. And then one of the images we just saw where you have the kind of translucent triangle kind of hovering in space, or these kind of diaphanous kind of fragments of fabric really give you a sense of places where, the lightness of touch in the paint makes it almost light as air, and then places where, as you said, it becomes so present and physical. And maybe that also has something to do with this volleying between these very extreme states. So, I mean, even for you to have, been able to create this work, I think we often, those of us who aren't makers of work, it's possible to take for granted what goes into their making, that ta-da, there's this finished work that's beautiful and you can appreciate it. But to know that, of course, you as an artist, as a mother, are still going through this same turmoil induced by COVID and of lockdown that all of the rest of us did. And that is borne witness to in the work, I think, is something that people will find to be really important, and maybe a way for them to have connection as well. With a work like this, Rhinoceros, we're coming to an earlier work. So this work is from 2016. And it's one that I've always found since it was made, these details are just so fascinating. The way that you've rendered the safety pins, or these kind of badges of Iron Maiden. And again, each one seems to be a kind of a portal or an invitation in that someone might recognize the Liberty print pattern on the kind of multiple red berries, or someone else might recognize having had an Iron Maiden badge of their own. So in thinking about how you create space for these, incredibly hybrid material culture objects to coexist, are these things that you physically collect in the studio?
I do have a nature table. So I do actually paint from, I'm being slightly facetious, but I do actually have some objects that I paint from life. But often I paint things that I don't have access to. And in that case, I just either paint from memory, or I paint my idea of what that thing is. And I can sometimes use source material, like for photographic source material, but often I find it's not really necessary, because I'm not trying to depict anything sort of in terms of a literal representation. This is an interesting painting in the sense that I love that. What I love about painting is that it can address more than one conversation at the same time. So this painting was based on an obsession I had with these sort of animals that were toured around 18th century European capitals as sort of curiosities. And as I was thinking very much about the nature of novelty and of fads and of crazes. And Parisian women at the time wore their hair in a sort of rhinoceros horn. And I was sort of thinking about all of that. At the time, I was actually pregnant and I was suffering from body dysmorphic condition, and it was really not in a very good place. And one evening I was taking my makeup off, and I just caught myself in the mirror, and I saw that I'd just twisted my hair up in exactly this, as I've painted it. And it was hair a la rhinoceros, as the Parisian women were wearing. And I was thinking, wow, it's like in this one gesture, I am sort of performing a gender role, but I'm also sort of stripping that away. And what I love about painting is that it can be, in this image, it's both things at once. It was a sort of reckoning with an idealized, sort of beauty standards that I was struggling with. But at the same time, it was an exploration of gender much more widely. But painting has the capacity to hold all of those things.
I think thinking about those slippages, about simultaneity and slippage, is really helpful, because I recognize that also in the vast range of your art historical references. Here we're about to come on to a suite of prints.
Right.
And, I see within that a whole range of different approaches, but knowing that, your work is referencing in some places Anna Maria Maiolino trying to find her place within an art historical canon, but equally trying to, carve out a space where you can be your own and not have to fit within a label or a genre. So again, even with you being a painter, I think it's wonderful to see this suite of prints within this context, and to think about this shift that can occur between how you evoke details on canvas and then or linen, and then on paper.
Yes, I absolutely love Anna Maria Maiolino's work, and her actually. She's just a lovely person. Funnily enough, so following on from the pregnancy story, there's a beautiful chronology to this, because I'd just given birth actually, and I'd found out that she was speaking in London at a breakfast. So I just hoiked the baby and we went to see her speak. And she was speaking about something that I'd never really realized was that widespread, particularly with art that's made by women, but I'm sure much more widely. And that's this sort of pseudomorphic knee-jerk labeling. In her case, she was just greatly and rightly just very irritated by being compared to Jackson Pollock the whole time, which I don't really understand. But I suppose, in the gesture, perhaps it was this very superficial boxing and categorizing of her work. And she was talking about that. And I just felt like such a huge burden sort of fall from my back, because I was like, oh, right, okay, this is a thing. Because I have, especially in the early days of my practice, sort of felt put in boxes as a surrealist box. And I just think, well, I don't think I love the surrealist movement, but I don't think that my work fits into that box particularly. They're plausible postulations. There's not sort of anything particularly surreal that's happening here. Perhaps there's a similarity of palette maybe, but it doesn't really seems like a superficial categorization. And I've realized that if you are making work sort of out, she referred to the male standard of this sort of very linear way of looking at art and categorizing art. And if you're making art from outside of that tradition, that traditional conventional way of looking at art, then you are very likely to be misunderstood, and sort of an easy label might be thrown in your direction. And that's just incredibly frustrating, because it's so reductive. And it stops people really understanding what they're looking at. And it's the invitation to look. It becomes something that's, the rug is pulled from under you if you feel like you've got this label on that doesn't make any sense. So I just found that very liberating. And also, she was very emotional to see a young artist with a baby making work and making a go of it, because she'd been through so many struggles as a woman and as an artist, trying to make her voice heard. And when her voice was heard, to make that understood. So actually, there's a very sort of happy end story to the depressing pregnancy one.
Oh, Anj, you're giving us so much. I really appreciate your openness and vulnerability. And I think that's honestly what each work does, is give us this invitation to look, and to look incredibly closely. You know, something like the lace that's shrouding this figure, to look at each of the insects and each of the flowers, and the coloration feels so special, because you can't fail but notice how much time and effort would have gone into it. I guess if we go back to the print just for a moment, I just wanted to linger on it, because I was wondering whether paring back your palette in order to focus online through a different technique, does that allow you to look differently, or to change the invitation to linger over details?
No, I really loved making this etching series, because, you know, it's the absolute antithesis of painting. Because I work in oil paint, if something's not right, I can sand it off, or I can repaint something over the top, frequently do. So it's very much, you know, the pressure's not really on, in a sense, because I can always edit and revise, and the painting evolves. It's got characteristics of its own, and it leaves traces, and you can work with those traces. Completely different psychological approach when I'm making an etching, because once you have inscribed into the metal of the zinc or the copper, that's it. There is no going back. So it's a very different process of working. But the reason that I made these etchings was because I was wanting to investigate that scrupulosity of the mark, because I feel as though my painting is actually abstract painting. I know it sounds absolutely counterintuitive to express it like that, but it's like there is so much representational mark that it's beyond any expectation of a literal depiction. And I just wanted to explore the edges of that, because I think as a painter, that's what I'm interested in, the edges of painting, the edges of representation, even of our understanding. That to me is a fascinating premise. Because of course, if you're at the edge, if you can see the edge, then you're not at the edge. But it was just quite an interesting philosophical conundrum to explore. And out of that came Night Hall, which is, you can only see one image here, but there's a gradation that's either from very low light to complete darkness, or vice versa. It depends which way you hang the work. So there's also something slightly fluid about the choice of hang as well.
Excellent. We can move on to the next one again. That way we can keep moving through the show. So some questions are coming through. The first of which is, will there be a publication or catalog to accompany the exhibition? And indeed, there is. Anj, do you want to say something at this point about how the publication came about, and how you thought about what you wanted to achieve within its pages? Because of course, even in reproducing your paintings or details of them, accessing through a book is a very different experience, you know, very intimate experience, kind of one-on-one, as opposed to what, you know, pre-COVID would have been a much more collective, spatialized experience in the gallery. So I think knowing that there is a catalog that people can access, maybe it's helpful for us to think about how you conceive the different experiences and ways into your work. How is the invitation to look made differently in the publication?
That's really interesting. I see the visual aspects of the publication as very much secondary, actually, purely because I just don't feel, even though Alex Delphane photographed the works to an incredible degree, he did a fantastic job, but it is absolutely impossible to get a visual understanding through photographic reproduction. Once you're in the exhibition and you see one of these paintings in the flesh, it's a completely different experience. However, I do think that publications serve a very, very vital role, actually, partly because some people can't physically get to an exhibition, but also what I think is incredibly important are people's written response to the work. That to me is, I think maybe I value that more than some other artists. I just think it's so, to have scholarly or very, very thoughtful text piece from a different perspective, is that for me is the value of the work. And the team that put the book together will attest to me saying that. I was absolutely thrilled with the text that you wrote, Zoe, and I can't thank you enough. I'll be eternally grateful. And we had a wonderful text from Jost Joestra as well. And
thanks. I was going to say, like, that's a wonderful text.
Yeah, it's amazing for me to read and to view because I'm a book reader. I do sometimes actually get to a painting via literature. So the text aspect of that contribution is incredibly significant for me.
If we come back to this work, since we've got this really stunning detail here, something that you said when we were looking at the prints, I think was really helpful. And that's understanding that these can be as sometimes, tactile and tantalizingly real as they are, that they are representations, just as an abstract form might be, and that it isn't possible to, as much try as we might, to make sense of all of the different associations and to have them cohere into one whole. And so I think knowing that the paintings aren't illustrative of a singular issue, but that you're embracing this multiplicity, and that you're so comfortable looking at a number of different major concepts in one, whether that's environmental peril or a kind of a state of gender inscrutability, and wanting to kind of tease that apart. And that's something I find particularly beautiful in the kind of fraying of this racerback shirt. I took that fraying as this kind of, this is my personal read, but very much thinking about it as a kind of an unraveling of what had seemed like such a tight weave of gender binaries, but we know that much, much more can exist. And because you've long dealt with that theme in your paintings, seeing how it might be elaborated materially in these other ways feels just incredibly rewarding, because you almost want to figure it out, but every time that's denied, it actually leads to something richer, because then your eye can volley to these different places. So I guess that to me is interesting, how you've come to establish your own visual language that is comfortable in this space of multiplicity and not trying to reduce it. Do you feel that took a long time to reach, or was that always there in your work?
I think perhaps it's to do with the fact that, each generation makes work slightly in relation to what went before. And, there was a lot of work that was made that was sort of quite singular while I was at art school. It was, the work is about this. And I've even had conversations at the time with people saying, while I was at art school, are you the feminist artist? Are you the environmentalist? Are you dealing with this? Are you dealing with that? Are you dealing with art history? And it's like, well, could I not be all of those things? Or can I not be all of those things in one painting and none of those things in another painting? It's just, I think there is the capacity for painting to hold all of these things together in a visual language is infinite. And I'm quite comfortable with that complexity. In fact, if anything, I think this exhibition is a celebration of complexity, of perhaps being comfortable. I mean, we've all gone through this year of great instability and a lack of control. And I think that's always been something that's been present in the work, of just sitting with that, because actually the idea of really useful categorizing of things, of phenomena, of sorting phenomena out into different areas, that's not really how we experience reality, is it? It's not how I experience reality. This is an interesting painting in terms of gender, because it's a slightly different treatment of gender in this work than in other works. And I think I see this painting as containing an awful lot of autobiography, actually, even though this is a male back. And in a lot of the work, the figure is, indeterminate gender deliberately so. But in this work, the figure is mostly male, I would say. But I very much see this as a self-portrait. And I wonder whether it might be that my first encounter with European historical painting, there was always the sort of general atop the horse. And as a young child, my connection with that kind of painting was always to relate to the central agency of the work, which was, of course, masculine. So I just think there's something of that in this work, for sure. I also think the elusive qualities of some of these paintings is deliberate. And I have referred before to sort of visual sort of gravel pit, almost like a chicanery, because throughout all of this exhibition, there's a real sort of countercultural plea to slow down, because we're so used to consuming information, whether it's visually or, if it's on an Instagram feed or digitally. Or
in a tweet, that it's got to be so quick. You can't even say it in more than this many characters. And
right.
To me, your work very much resists that. You're never going to get all of it in one grasp. Like, great, I've seen it, I get it, move on. Unless you spend time and look at it, and it will yield many more questions than answers. But I think that it definitely feels like part of it, that the invitation to look equally being an invitation to slow down and to look carefully and to take care, feels like something that maybe we all need right now.
I think I am actually quite worried about the way that a lot of information that's disseminated feels very easily consumable. Like a lot of rhetoric that's bandied about, perhaps politically, it sounds good, but if you unravel it, there's nothing there. I think there's a danger of a lot of empty, pleasing sounding rhetoric having sort of real world consequences. And I think the one thing that art can do is sharpen our sense of criticality, of critical thinking, of questioning everything. And I do think that is a social function that art can provide. I think that is quite an important thing, that we keep thinking and questioning, and that we're comfortable with knowledge banks and expertise, and we value that.
Well, shall we move on to the next image? False Stewart is one that I think is, incredibly wonderful, because, the face is entirely obscured, but there's still a sense of recognizing someone else's humanity within that. And, where we started the conversation earlier, in terms of thinking about if your agency isn't recognized or validated externally, how do you communicate that? I think that there's something incredibly poetic about how that seems to be synthesized within a painting such as this.
Yes, so this is the painting that I most associate with Ophelia. I haven't called the painting, I haven't titled the painting Ophelia, because it's not a depiction of the character. But it certainly came from just the fact that, Ophelia was such a disruptor. And I think that's why she was silenced, because she was a threat. She was actually speaking sort of truth to power in the Danish court. But I'm so inspired by how she used, language is formed from the society that shapes it. So exactly as you're saying, Zoe, if your agency is not recognized, then how do you communicate? And I think when she uses that in the text, she uses bits of pop songs and ditties, and she puts all of these things together. And that's why it's so easy to say, oh, well, she was just mad. But I think she's subversive. I think she's subverting those linguistical codes in order to express what those codes excluded. And that to me is I think she's such an important cipher for approaching. I do believe painting now, we can't just pretend that the problematic canon of art history didn't exist. So I think we are in a position, I feel as though I'm in a position to be inspired by Ophelia because she looks at what she's got, and she doesn't accept the situation, but she cuts and splices and makes the language her own. And it has huge, profound resonances for me in thinking of painting in the studio.
When did you get back in the studio? Because you mentioned earlier on that there was a period of time when, everything was happening within the walls of your home, and then you going up to the attic to be able to paint. Was there a kind of an exhalation or a sense of relief or release in getting back to the studio?
I mean, there really are no words at all. I mean, I was very mindful while I had that time at home to be grateful that I even had a space to be painting in for a start. And also, I did enjoy certain aspects of having, my family see what I do. But at the same time, I think I couldn't even cry with relief when I got back to the studio, because it was just so overwhelming that now I'd started work on a 3-meter long painting because I started making much bigger work. And I had to obviously abandon that when the pandemic broke out. So it was just incredible. I kept having to say to myself, no, you can really work on what you want now. You can work on what you want. You can do this 3-meter long painting if you want. And it was kind of, I had to sort of remind myself that I was back to thinking everything's possible again in the studio. So it was just such a cathartic moment. It was a moment of joy. Wow. Just to get space back,
To give yourself the permission. Yeah. And then to ease back into that. Maybe if we move to the next image, because there are some images within the slideshow that give a sense of that vast scale, that you can be working on this kind of almost painting miniatures, kind of jewel-like scale to this vast scale. In a work like this, we come back to some of what you've said earlier in relation to the differences of handling paint, and that we effectively have, a near 3-dimensional surface here. It almost becomes like a bas-relief sculpture, the way you've created this terrain.
This is an interesting detail to land on, actually, in terms of what you've just been saying, because I don't know whether you can see, but there's some of the paint has just been squeezed from the tube, straight from the tube. And a lot of the time, I think it's quite easy to think of my work as very small brushes, very minutely detailed, but actually there are so many different kinds of painting languages that are always employed. And in fact, you can see that beautiful blue, that's such a matte blue, it's incredible. I just literally just got the tube of paint and squirted it onto the canvas. And there are aspects of, work that's made with palette knives, and this, even on this small scale, there's this kind of color bank. It's almost like an abstract bank of color. Lots of different kinds of painting languages are employed in this work. So I'm glad we've landed on this detail to show people that. And also then just carving these funny skulls.
That's what I wanted to ask you about next, is these lost souls kind of nestled within it.
Well, you'll see in the background of this work that there's the moon from Studio 54, but minus the light bulbs and minus the spoon. And it's almost as though it's the end of one epoch, the end of a position, the end of a culture of hedonism, to a survival of something that caused that to end, which is unspecified in the work. And it's a different epoch that we're now seeing at play. And I'm thinking of the protagonist that is perhaps dwelling in this landscape and curating these objects. Perhaps they are the person, or they are the group of people that have made these little sculptures in the rock, that have left their mark in the rock in that way. Mm-hmm. And maybe it's thousands and thousands of years in the future. Who knows even if these are human. There's a sense of, you could read that in two different ways. There's a sort of ambiguity to this image, because it could just be an image of horror, really, that it's, everything that was fun and, this incredible idealistic disco period, that's all finished. So it could be sort of it could be read on that level, but it could also be read on the level of, well, when catastrophic things happen, nature has a way of always bringing things back, and there's always some kind of survival that happens that is possible. And in some of the still life-esque works, there's fossils that bring that note into it. It's like, yes, this was the end of that epoch, but something else has happened and has taken its place. And that there's a sort of note of regeneration, actually, that sometimes gets missed.
Yeah, a real resilience.
Yes, exactly. That runs through this exhibition for sure.
So if we go to the next slide, that might be nearly the end. And certainly for the participants in the room, if you have any questions, we're in about the last 5 or 10 minutes of our conversation. The hour's gone so quickly. I have more questions for Anj, and one that I can kind of end on, but please do feel that you can use the chat if you have any further questions. You don't have to be shy. I will read them out. But so Anj, one of the things that you'd mentioned was that your reading, so text as a source material, can often form the basis of what becomes the visual within a painting. So what are you reading at the moment?
Wow, I'm tempted to turn my screen around so you can see all of the things that I have in front of me. I feel as if I mention anything, it's going to sort of they'd be looked for in the work.
Okay.
Such a variety of different.
Don't mean it as a trap, so definitely just curious.
Well, no, it's an interesting question actually, because you're right. I grew up without television or films or any kind of popular culture references, and
you talked a lot about that. So then your window to the world, your invitation to look, comes via the written word.
Yes, exactly. There were no, we didn't go to galleries as a family, for example. That was not on our radar. So yes, exactly. My access to outside context was through books. And I think that really formed the way that I sort of cognitively think about stuff, because it's how I escape and it's how I relax even now, really. So I read for lots of different reasons. Obviously, I read things like Hamlet, has been huge in terms of this exhibition, but I also read hugely just for the pleasure of escaping into outside of my own head. It's one of the things that I found that has really helped in terms of anxiety and depression, is to escape into something that's so absorbing that you disappear into it. So as an example, I've reread Vikram Seth, A Suitable Boy. I'm in a book group and I suggested that we read that, and I don't know, it's an absolute block of a book and people were not very happy with me, but it's such an incredible novel because it's the examination of set of circumstances, but through the eyes of lots of different characters and experiences. And yes, I always think if I can do in painting what that kind of masterpiece of literature can do, then I would be very happy.
Wonderful. We've got some questions that have come through now. So the first is, who was the first author you navigated towards in your youth?
Wow, that's a great question, actually.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you, although I'm not sure it bears much relation on the work, but I read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I was very lucky in that the girl that I sat next to in high school, her mum was an English teacher, and she's still a great friend of mine today, actually. And this whole world of literature, good books, was brought into my life through this friend. And she was very articulate and very, they had a culture in that family of discussing what they read, which was just an anathema to me. I didn't understand it at first, but The Grapes of Wrath was the first proper wonderful book that I read when I was 11, and I've not reread it. I've resisted rereading it because that was the gateway to me. So if I reread it and then I find it lesser than I remember it, then I would find that quite depressing.
No, some things you just want to stay in that moment.
Things out there.
So one question is, did you use source material to paint the rock in Night in May?
Oh, that's interesting. No, I didn't. I do look at a lot of geological journals, and I do love to follow archaeological digs, and they found some very, very early tools that were made prior to anyone thinking that any tools had been made by any human activity ever. And I'm just really interested in that because I'm working on a painting, which I won't show you because it's in its very initial stages, called Artists' Tools. And I'm just fascinated by that. So
brilliant. And I think this will have to be the last question. Oh, well, another one's just come in, but these will be the last two. And it is, which painting in the show did you most enjoy painting, and which was the most challenging?
Wow, those are very, very good questions. I don't know that I enjoy painting. I don't know if I'd use that word. There are, I think, probably landscapes of arboreality is probably the most important painting to me personally in this exhibition, just because I painted that after recovering from a period of very severe postnatal depression. And I remember finally being well, and so perhaps this is why I relate to Ophelia. It's just, I'm not somebody that really romanticizes mental health problems. I don't feel as though it's a great catalyst for creativity. Actually, in my experience, it's been very paralyzing. But I'd come out of that experience and survived it, and was back in the studio and was making a painting sort of referencing some aspects of it. But I remember painting, and you can see this in the exhibition, little tours of paint, the marks, the little marks of paint, they stand proud from the surface. And I remember making this new mark on the work, and I'd never made that before. And I remember thinking, okay, this is actually a testament to survival. So that's a painting that's quite close to my heart, that one. But all of these paintings, I don't have assistants. I sort of agonize over them myself. So it's kind of like seeing old friends when I open the show. The most challenging painting was by far the 3-meter long new scale work, because I had to physically train to be able to stand up a ladder for that length of time, which has been brilliant because now I do carry on with the running that I needed to do to get back into shape. But that was a challenge that was actually a physical challenge as well as a conceptually rigorous challenge.
Brilliant. And so finally, and this is from a fellow artist, as a painter, do you feel you have to defend this ever? I've had to fight for painting as my practice within an academic setting, finding I have to categorize my work. Thank you.
Yes, I really can relate to that. I think actually there's a new spirit in contemporary painting. I certainly feel this way. I feel that for so long, painting has suffered from these really redundant art school-esque, hand-wringing, which doesn't necessarily really help anyone. I think, for so many years, it was like, well, painting is a pointless medium. Like, trying to encapsulate experience in any kind of language will always fall short of that. So why bother? But I think the reason that I think that painting is so apt for this moment right now is because it's not just about the attempt at communicating, which is valid in itself in any medium, but it's also an expression of agency. It's conceptual art, as any other kind of art. Conceptual art doesn't have to be made in a particular medium. I would encourage you to completely ignore anything like that and just carry on forging your own furrow.
That is very good advice. We know that the death of painting has been announced many, many times, and it seems to revive itself. So I think with that, it behooves me to hand back over to Deborah and to thank all of you for being such wonderful participants and to listen. And Anj, thank you for your work.
Thank you.
For the exhibition.
Thanks for your great questions, Zoe, as ever.
Thank you both. That was really amazing. I could sit and listen to you both all day. I really could. I'm sure lots of people feel the same. So you were so right in that Anj gives us so much, both in the work, but also in the eloquent way that she
he talks about it and is so honest about it. And so thank you for really kind of probing and being able to bring out some of these really interesting points and interesting concepts within the work. I don't want to do kind of an Oscar type thank you for everyone, but while I'm here, just to say thanks to all the team at the New Art Gallery Walsall. Everyone has contributed in different ways to this project, and really proud of everyone. And it's such a pleasure and a privilege to have this show. Do come and see it if you can. I'd like to thank also all the Hauser and Worth team, to Ed and Russell, who have helped with hosting this event tonight, but also the wider team, particularly Corinne, Aileen, Poppy, Theo, who have all contributed hugely to it. Thank you to Mark Hinton of Blend Films for filming the intro film to this event. And thank you to all the lenders, of course, without whom we wouldn't have half a show. And I really want to thank everyone for coming. We do have a little survey that we would be really appreciative if you could just take time to complete this survey. It's to really kind of explore the qualitative response in terms of evaluation to these types of events, and it'll really help us to go forward and kind of look at how we can improve events in the future and kind of make them what people really want them to be. I hope some of you, I'm not sure who is here tonight, but I hope many of you will be able to visit Walsall, because as we've said, these paintings are so special, and the experience of seeing them in the flesh is very different to seeing them on screen or in a book. And so if you do have a chance to come over and see us, please do. You don't have to book. Please look at our website for all the details and for all the precautions that we have around protecting your safety when you come to visit us. No booking is required, by the way. We do have a couple of other events which you might be interested in the future. Anj mentioned Joost Joustra, who also wrote for our publication, and Anj and Joost will be in conversation, hopefully at the gallery itself, at the 2nd of September. And we also have the wonderful Kezia Joseph, who's been developing a performance in response to the exhibition, and that will be presented on the 10th of July, and we'll also be filming it. This is very fresh in our mind because we had a wonderful day with Kezia yesterday, and I think we're still quite overwhelmed by it, but so we really look forward to being able to welcome people to share that with us too. So from me, thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you for participating in our event today. We really hope you've enjoyed it. As I mentioned, do complete the survey if you can. That'll be hugely helpful to us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.